Good afternoon. Wow, everybody paid attention. There you go. Let me talk you through what we will be doing this afternoon. In a moment, we will have a paper by Alex Rosenberg. And 5-minute break after that, we will have a paper by James Sinclair. And then we will rearrange the stage for a panel discussion, and there will be some more time for Q&A from the audience. So that will mean that you need to stay out of the aisle right here and over there, because we're going to need to get some microphones set up for that. But we can do that, and so it'll be great. Let me introduce our next speaker. Alex Rosenberg is the R. Taylor Cole Professor of Philosophy with secondary appointments in the Biology and Political Science departments and chair of the Philosophy Department at Duke University. Rosenberg is the author of several books, including The Atheist's Guide to Reality, Darwinian Reductionism, or How to Stop Worrying and Love Molecular Biology, Darwinism in Philosophy, Social Science, and Policy, and Microeconomic Laws, a Philosophical Analysis. He is also the editor of The Philosophy of Biology, a Contemporary Introduction with Daniel McShay. Let's welcome Alex as he comes to speak.
As the Python crowd used to say, and now for something completely different. We've heard a lot about cosmology this morning and last night, and some of what I will have to say will touch on issues related to that. But I wanted to talk about something different, about the relationship of Darwinism and theism, of Darwin's theory of natural selection and theism. What I have to say, surprisingly enough, given that I'm the author of a book with the disobliging title, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, may turn out to be very congenial to people in this room. All I can say about that fact is I didn't intend it to be congenial. So, you have on the PowerPoint two Old Testament fathers, Charles Darwin and Lord Kelvin. And although you probably can't see it, on the extreme right, extreme left, is a wonderful adaptation. That's an insect that looks like a leaf. In the middle is the double helix, and on the other side you've got gas molecules bouncing from one container to another. And I'll explain each of those bits of iconography as I go along. So what I want to talk about is the incompatibility of Darwin's theory of natural selection and theism. Sophisticated theists, and especially the Darwinians among them, tend to combine their religious and their scientific beliefs in a way that enables them to hold both of these views together. And the usual way is the way that Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health and the former director of the Human Genome Project, does in his best-selling book, The Language of God. But he's only the latest of a long line of sophisticated theists and scientists who've held that God produced us by using the mechanism that Charles Darwin discovered. And that's why there's no incompatibility between theism and Darwinism. And I'm going to try to show you that that reconciliation won't work. You've got to take your choice, Darwinism or theism, on my view. Let's begin by thinking about what the basic criteria are for the adequacy of a theory of adaptation. And by a theory of adaptation, I mean a theory that explains the beautiful means-ends fittedness of things to their environment, of biological living things to their environments, and of the parts of living things to one another in order to fulfill, to meet the needs, to confer the advantages and the benefits that they do on the organisms that they are parts of in their environment. That's what adaptations are, and it is job number one in biology to explain adaptations. Now, what are the criteria that we impose, or that biology, that empirical science imposes on any possible theory of adaptation? The first one is that it has to begin with zero adaptation. It has to start from zero adaptation and then build all the adaptations using a process which, at least at the outset, isn't itself an adaptation. The second requirement on biological theory, indeed on any theory outside of physics, is consistency with physics. It's got to be compatible with quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, atomic bonding, chemical catalysis, what we know as well established in physical theory. The third requirement, as I'm going to explain on any theory of adaptation, is there's one particular piece of physics that it's got to harness. It's got to make use of the second law of thermodynamics. So let's talk about those three criteria a little more. The zero adaptation requirement. A theory that starts with an adaptation already, that helps itself to the first adaptation and then builds all the subsequent adaptations on that one, begs the question of where the first adaptation comes from. A scientific theory that hopes to show us how, as a purely causal process, adaptations ever emerged, has to start from a base in which there are no adaptations. The problem with Lamarck's theory, the theory you may well remember as displaced by Darwin's, Lamarck's theory was that acquired characteristics can be inherited. And the real problem with that as an explanation of adaptations, something is adapted because it was needed in the past, and the acquired characteristic that conferred that need was inherited to the next generation and conferred that benefit in the next generation. That Lamarckian theory rests on the existence of a wonderful adaptation, some means within the organism for storing information about current states and needs and how they are met and transmitting them to the next generation. That's such a phenomenally wonderful adaptation, if it actually obtains, that we need an explanation of how that adaptation could have emerged. And the ultimately satisfactory explanation has to start with a completely mindless, brute matter of causal fact that has no adaptational characteristics at all. So, second constraint on a theory of adaptation. It's got to be compatible with what we already know from physics. Physics is by far the most well-established of our sciences. I often point out that quantum mechanics is easier than biology or psychology or economics, and the proof of that is we've made so much more progress in quantum mechanics than we have in these other disciplines. The power of physics is reflected in its predictive reach and its explanatory depth. Any theory that's inconsistent with physics is going to be suspect. Indeed, Darwin was so anxious about this that nothing made him more disquiet than Lord Kelvin, the leading physicist of the British civilization of the 19th century. Nothing made him more nervous than the fact that Lord Kelvin claimed that Darwin's theory was incompatible with physics, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Why trust physics? Well, the reason that we should trust physics is, of course, its explanatory depth and its predictive power. Physics, of course, is not complete. A lot of physics, indeed probably most of it, is false. False in the sense that it's an approximation to the truth, and we still have further room to approach the truth more closely than we have so far. And of course there are domains of phenomena of nature about which physics has almost nothing to say. Dark matter, dark energy, many of the issues on which Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig debated yesterday and about which we heard this morning. There are, of course, phenomenally difficult conceptual problems involved in reconciling quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity. These are the problems that, of course, superstring theory, M theory, hopes to deal with. These are matters in physics that are up for grabs. And in the degree to which they're up for grabs, they can not really constrain biological explanation. But there are parts of physics that do constrain biological explanation. The parts that are extremely well confirmed and unlikely to be overturned almost no matter what happens in the future course of physical exploration. Exploration of the theories in physics that enable us to understand domains like dark matter and dark energy and reconciling quantum and general relativity. What are the parts of physics that constrain physics that are not in doubt? There are a couple, and they're very simple, they're very obvious, and they've been understood, some of them ever since Newton. What Newton did, what the scientific revolution of the 17th century did, was overthrow the Aristotelian worldview. It showed that we did not have to postulate purposes, goals, ends, teleologies, entelechies, vital forces, minds, or any such entities in the explanation of the dynamics and kinematics of matter. Physics read purpose out of nature in the 17th century. It excluded in particular the possibility of future causation, events in the future reaching back into the past and determining the course, the trajectory of events which would approach them. Of course, that violates the special theory of relativity, the finitude of the propagation of light. But even before the prohibition of causal signals faster than light, physics had excluded future causation and thereby excluded purpose and teleology from the explanatory quiver of the physical sciences. The other part of physics that we need that constrains biology is the second law of thermodynamics. It's ironical, in fact, that Kelvin made the world safe for Darwinism. Indeed, he didn't merely make it safe for Darwinism, he made it the case that the only possible way in which adaptations could emerge consistent with the laws of physics is the way that Darwin discovered. That's a very strong claim, and I'm going to be prepared to defend it. The only possible way that adaptations have emerged in the universe, given the laws of physics, is the way that Darwin discovered. What is the second law of thermodynamics? It's the claim that entropy probably increases, and the probably is almost certainly, but not quite. Not 1.0, but I think Sean gave us a decimal with how many nines? 27? 30 or so. More. You'd need more than that for a counterexample. Well, maybe not more than that. But the universe is moving towards greater disorder, and local increases in order, according to the second law, must be paid for by greater decreases in order elsewhere. Those are the key features. Now, the interesting thing about Kelvin's threat to Darwinism was that in addition to being the leading thermodynamicist of the 19th century, Kelvin was in a position, using his theory, to date the age of the Earth, the age of the Sun and the age of the Earth. And by his calculation, the Sun couldn't be more than 40 million years old. And Darwin had asserted in the theory, in The Origin of Species, that the required time for the evolution of vertebrate life was 300 million years. Ergo, Kelvin was able to refute Darwin. What was interesting was both were off by orders of magnitude. Kelvin knew nothing about thermodynamics. It was Hans Bethe who discovered what the nature of solar combustion was in the period just after World War II, largely for which he won the Nobel Prize. And Darwin was wrong about the amount of time required for evolution. It wasn't 300 million years. Evolution's been going on this planet for 3 billion years. But the threat of physics trumping biology was one that Darwin considered most serious. Why should evolutionary adaptation have to be driven by the second law? Well, consistency with the second law is not enough, and the reason is that the second law is the only asymmetrical law among all the fundamental laws of nature. All of the fundamental laws outside of the second law are time symmetrical. Things work forward in just the way they work backwards. That's true of the Schrödinger wave equation as well. Evolution, however, the emergence of adaptation over time is an asymmetrical affair and therefore had to be driven by the second law. Now, only Darwin's theory can satisfy the three constraints. Starts with zero adaptations, just the thermodynamic mingling of molecules over long periods of time, bouncing against one another. Builds adaptations non-teleologically by the process of blind variation and passive environmental filtration of those variations, and operating by building order through the expense of greater disorder. So no foresight in natural selection, no process that's already adapted for producing no adaptations, local energy minimas preserved by quick and dirty solutions to environmental design problems, and the improvement in order must be rare and expensive. Think about mutations. They're the paradigm example of random processes in nature. Quick and dirty solutions to design problems that hardwire imperfections of various kinds because they are thermodynamically energy minimizing in biological adaptation. So my three pictures are, of course, a picture of a mutation, a picture of the cometary impact 65 million years ago that destroyed the dinosaurs, and the way in which previously wired-in solutions constrain novel biological adaptations. If you think about biology of life, you'll realize that what has evolved is extremely wasteful. The mechanism of heredity, for example, looks like it has taken the second law of thermodynamics deeply to heart. It involves a huge amount of order, each generation in each generation throwing away all this order in order to produce a small number of copies of the organisms in the previous generation. Nothing could be more expensive than sex in terms of wasting order, and yet sex is the predominant mode of reproduction on our planet. One wants to ask oneself, what is it for? This is a great problem of evolutionary theory. Why do we have sex given how wasteful it is as a way of preserving order? And there are a variety of answers, but all of them have to honor the second law of thermodynamics. So in a second law world, adaptation is going to be rare, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be accidental. It's going to be produced by the objective probabilities of thermodynamics. It's going to involve spending more disorder globally in order to preserve a small amount of order locally, and it's not going to happen many places in the universe. In fact, maybe it's only going to happen in one place in the universe. So the Darwinian processes succeed in building adaptations because they're driven by the second law, and the second law processes are all probabilistic. They're all matters of objective probability. The probability is not the probability of the gambling casino or the roulette wheel. It's not a priori probability. It's not the subjective probability that merely involves the way psychological credences get updated in accordance with Bayes' law. It may not even be based, it doesn't have to be based on the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics. The probabilities are objective, the ones that Darwin's theory is driven, appeals to, and that the Darwinian processes are driven by. It's an inherently chancy process. Population drift is another feature which works along with random mutation to produce adaptational outcomes that are the result of the workings of objective chance. It's very clear if we think about the earliest adaptation, the very first molecule that combined stability and replication at levels high enough to survive on the Earth, that the process that brought it about could only have done so by a thermodynamic process. Now, why does this make theism incompatible with Darwinism? Well, theism is the three omnis, you'll recall: omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence plus benevolence. But it's one more thing. It's also the claim that we were made in God's image. God had an image, a representation, an idea of what he wanted when he produced us, and he achieved us. Well, God was omniscient, and an omniscient agent wouldn't use an unreliable device in order to produce us. An omniscient agent, God, would know that the process of blind variation and natural selection operated in accordance with the objective probabilities, indeed was driven by the objective probabilities of the second law of thermodynamics. An omniscient God would therefore know that the use of the second law of thermodynamics as a tool to bring us about would be highly unreliable. Recall Stephen Jay Gould's wonderful image. If you rewind the tape of life, he often would say, and you start from the beginning on the Earth, right, the boundary conditions of organic molecules as they obtained on this Earth 3.5 million years ago, and then you use the process of blind variation and natural selection to move forward, the probability of the emergence of life was low. The probability of the emergence of vertebrate life was even lower. The probability of the emergence of mammalian life was minuscule. The probability of the emergence of sentient life was even smaller, and of sapient life was vanishingly small. God would have known this, okay? God would have known that the method that Darwin discovered by which nature produces us was not a method that could reliably do so, that anyone could attach much confidence in its ability to produce us or even anything much like us. Adaptation in the universe is rare, expensive, accidental, and we are the rarest, most expensive, and certainly the most accidental of evolutionary outcomes. Why would God use a chancy method to make us? Suppose you ask yourself, well, God, omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, and wanting to make us in his own image, and deciding to tie one hand behind his back and saying, let's do it with a method that's chancy. Let's do it with a method that involves objective chance. Is there a way in which he could undertake that kind of a task, handicapping himself that way? Well, I and other philosophers who've worried about this have thought about what these ways could be, and about the only thing that we've come up with is this. God could well have created indefinitely many universes, multiverses, the out of the quantum foam. This is where my talk touches on Sean and Bill's talk. God could have created a huge number of universes, right? Among which one of them happened to produce us. And that would have been the method that he would use. This huge number of universes, okay, reflects the improbability of the one universe in which we exist coming into existence. In order to ensure our existence, in order to bring us about, he brought about the multiverse. And we turn out to be the only one of the universes in the multiverse in which humans existed. But of course, there are going to turn out to be a large number of other universes on this view in which there is life, and maybe even multicellular life, and vertebrate life, and mammalian life, and maybe some less than human forms of sapient and sentient life. And you can see that, of course, the possibility of indefinitely many of such worlds is going to seriously exacerbate the theist's problem of evil. Why is it that God should have created so many worlds with so much suffering simply in order to allow himself the luxury of objective chance being part of the vehicle for producing us and thereby reconciling himself to Darwin's theory? Fundamentally, it doesn't make sense. If those are the lengths that we have to go in order to reconcile Darwinism and theism, we're going to find ourselves with an agenda of much more serious theological problems. There's something else God could have done, of course. God could have created us by a means so fiendishly clever that involved so many complications, that involved so many laws of nature and boundary conditions working together, that we, as smart as we are, will never be able to figure out what that process was. We will never be smart enough to identify the laws that governed our evolution from the basic distribution of matter at the beginning of the universe. God, in his omniscience, knew that we would be the inevitable and unavoidable consequence of the operation of these laws, but he also knew that we wouldn't be smart enough to figure them out. He might well have known that the best we could do, and it's pretty good, is Darwin's theory of blind variation and natural selection. That the very best instrument we had for organizing our understanding of the biosphere and for doing medicine and agriculture and public health and making new pharmaceuticals, all of the things which Darwin's theory has enabled us to do, it has enabled us to do only because it is a very good instrument, only because it is a heuristically useful but nevertheless false theory about how we got here. This, I take it, would not be a reconciliation of theism and Darwinism. It would simply be a way of saying that Darwin's theory is false. It's the best we can do, but it's not the correct theory of how we got here. That, I take it, is no reconciliation of Darwinism and theism. Francis Collins would not be happy to defend against the members of the National Academy of Sciences the reconciliation of theism and Darwinism by saying, well, theism is true and Darwinism is a really good, useful instrument, but strictly false. I've been thinking, does this argument work not just against theists, but also against agnostics? It might well. It might turn out that, of course, you can't have your religion and eat your sciences too if you're a theist. You can't have theism, and in particular the thesis that God made us in his image, and Darwinian theory. You could, of course, be a deist. You could, of course, hold that God in his wisdom organized things to move in a certain way and then turned his back on the process, and that process eventuated in us, but we were not his intended outcome. Nothing that happened in particular in the history of the universe from the time he set it in motion was his intended outcome. But I take it that this religious doctrine is not one that scientists are going to be particularly willing to or interested in arguing about. This goes back to Sean's point about a theism that has little content, a doctrine of God's existence that makes no claims about the nature of reality that we could compare to reality in order to credibilify the particular theology. That's why deism is, in my view, not a theology worth arguing about. But of course, agnosticism claims to be neutral as between whether theism is true or theism is false. Well, if my argument is right, then you really can't be an agnostic and a Darwinian. You can't hold that the theory of natural selection is true as an account of the emergence of adaptations on this planet by a process that involved objective chance, and that theism could be true for all we know, but we don't have enough knowledge. Because we do have enough knowledge, we know that the process that produced us is incompatible with one go to the unarguable tenet of theism, the claim that we were the intended outcome of God's intervention in the universe. And so it turns out that not only will Darwinism be incompatible with theism, but it may also be incompatible with agnosticism. I began by saying that there may well be many people in the audience that are congenial to this view. What I've said is you have to choose between theism and Darwinism. And of course, if you're a young Earth creationist, if you're an exponent of intelligent design, then you will not have any trouble with my conclusion. You will adopt, between the two alternatives that I present, between which I claim there is a forced choice, the alternative of theism. But if you hope to have an account, the best account of us as natural systems, and the slightest prayer of employing that account to understand our past and to ameliorate our future, you're going to have to buy Darwin's theory and give up theism. Thank you.
Is this mic live? Yes, okay. Well, it's a challenge to know how to respond to Alex Rosenberg's paper. In Professor Maudlin's case, there were enough relevant points to comment on that one could ignore the red herrings. But Dr. Rosenberg's paper is entirely off topic. If the Greer-Heard Forum this year had been on the topic God and evolutionary biology, then Dr. Rosenberg's paper would make a relevant contribution. But our topic is God in light of contemporary cosmology, and Dr. Rosenberg's paper has almost nothing to say about cosmology. So, should I just sit down, or do I follow the hounds in pursuit of the red herring? Well, since our quarry is nowhere in sight, I think I may as well join the hounds for a short distance. First, it's evident that Dr. Rosenberg fails in his first objective to prove that physics is sufficient for all appearances of design in nature. For he assumes that all appearances of design in nature are biological in character. But that is to ignore the fine-tuning of the universe, which sets the table for biological evolution. In particular, his appeal to the second law of thermodynamics takes no cognizance of one of the most extraordinary instances of fine-tuning, namely the initial low-entropy condition of the universe. Second, he fails to establish his second objective, that natural selection is the only way consistent with physics that the appearances of design can emerge. For he never proves that natural selection is sufficient for the appearance of biological design. Dr. Rosenberg's entire paper reads like a Darwinian, or better, naturalistic confession of faith. So what is the evidence that natural selection operating on random variations accounts for observed biological complexity? Many of us probably think that if random mutation and natural selection can explain, for example, the evolution of the horse, then that surely shows the power of these Darwinian mechanisms. In fact, evolution within a single kind like this is trivial compared to the vast range of life. You might think, well, if we could show that random mutation and natural selection could explain, say, how a bat and a whale evolved from a common ancestor, that would surely show the explanatory power of these mechanisms. Sorry, think again. Consider this figure from Sean Carroll. That's a different Sean Carroll. The figure shows major groups or phyla of the animal kingdom. Notice that a bat and a whale are both mammals, which is just one of the subcategories under the chordates. Even the evolution of a bat and a whale from a common ancestor is an utter triviality compared to the vast range of the animal kingdom. Now, if that takes your breath away, take a look at this. The whole of the previous slide that you just saw is contained on the little twig of the right-hand branch labeled animals, and the twig to the right of it, plants, contains the whole of the plant kingdom. And these are just 2 twigs on the branch of eukaryotes. The extrapolation of the Darwinian mechanisms from peppered moths and fruit flies and finch beaks to the production and evolution of every living thing is a breathtaking extrapolation of gargantuan, Brobdingnagian proportions. We know that in science, such extrapolations often fail. So again, I think we're compelled to ask, what is the evidence for this extraordinary extrapolation? Finally, Dr. Rosenberg fails to show that theism and Darwinism are incompatible. When biologists say that the mutations responsible for evolutionary change occur randomly, they do not mean by chance or purposelessly. Rather, as Francisco Ayala explains, they mean irrespective of their usefulness to the organism. Now, this is hugely significant, for then randomness is not incompatible with divine direction or purpose. For example, suppose that God in his providence causes a mutation to occur in an organism, not for the benefit of the organism, but for some other reason, say to produce easy prey for other organisms that he wants to flourish. In such a case, the mutation is both purposeful and random. And God wouldn't even need to intervene miraculously if he knew the relevant counterfactuals of evolutionary development, that if the laws of nature were applied to certain initial conditions, such and such life form would emerge. So, I'd say that the theist can be a Darwinist if he wants to, but I've yet to be convinced that the neo-Darwinian account of biological evolution really gives us the full story.
I think that that Alex's talk provides a great opportunity to step back a little bit and draw some of the connections between cosmology, entropy, and Darwinism and the origin of life. It's often said, and again, not in this particular forum, but there is an argument against natural selection and Darwinian evolution that creationists sometimes bring up that is clearly false, but it's false in an interesting way. It says, the second law of thermodynamics says that disorder increases in the universe. Things run down. Eventually you will reach a heat death of the universe. So the argument says, how in the world can a universe governed by the second law develop such wonderful, complex, organized structures like we see here in the biosphere on Earth? There's a simple one-line refutation of that argument, which is that the second law says that entropy increases in closed systems, and the biosphere is not a closed system. Therefore, the argument simply does not apply. There's no law of physics that says the entropy of our biosphere has to go up. And that's true, but it still leaves unanswered the question of, okay, but why did all of this complexity and order and interestingness arise? Even if it's compatible with the second law doesn't say it has to become more complex over time. And that's a very interesting process that is not completely understood. It's very understandable, and I think that it's an open area of science that we're having a lot of fun with right now. So it's fun to think about exactly what's going on. Our Earth is very far from thermal equilibrium. Thermal equilibrium is the state you would be in when you'd maxed out your entropy. Everything was as dull as possible. The air in this room is pretty close to thermal equilibrium. It's all uniform and nothing is happening. The Earth is very far from that, and the reason why is because the sun is a hot spot in a cold sky. If you ask people sometimes why is the sun important for biology, for life on Earth, they might tell you, well, the sun, the rays from the sun, the radiation gives us energy. That's actually not true. If the whole sky were the temperature of the sun, we would be getting a lot more energy than we do now. However, what would happen is that the Earth would come to the temperature of the sun and life would cease. If the whole sky were dark, we'd get no energy. The whole Earth would come to the temperature of the night sky and life would cease. The only reason we can have life is because we get some photons from the sun, but particularly in a low entropy form. We then radiate out that energy right back to the universe. Overall, the Earth does not gain energy from the universe. Recently, it has been gaining energy because of global warming, but that's a minor little effect, and you'll be debating that next year. But usually, the amount of energy we give back to the universe is the same we get from the sun. But for every one photon, for every one particle of light we get from the sun, we radiate 20 photons back into the universe. We have increased the entropy of that sunlight by a factor of 20. The Earth not only is compatible with the second law of thermodynamics, it is an engine for increasing entropy to beat the band. And that's related to the origin of complexity. Complexity and entropy are very different things. If you think of stirring milk into a cup of coffee, before you stir the milk, the entropy is low. You have milk and you have coffee. After you stirred it, the entropy is high. They're all mixed up together. But before you stir the milk, it's a simple system. Milk, coffee. After you stir the milk, it's also a simple system. Everything is mixed up together. It's only in between, when you start mixing the milk into the coffee and the tendrils of milk mix in complicated ways, that you have a high degree of complexity. The universe is the same way. The early universe was very low entropy. The late universe will be very high entropy. But the early universe was a very simple place. And the late universe will also be a simple place. It's the middle phase of the history of the universe that is complex. The point is not that complexity requires low entropy. Complexity requires entropy to be increasing. The maintenance of complexity, as in a living being, requires that you are very far from equilibrium, living in an environment where entropy is going up to beat the band. So not only is the existence and evolution of life on Earth compatible with the second law of thermodynamics, in some very real sense, it's a spin-off. It is a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law, in turn, happens because the early universe has a low entropy, which is a fundamentally cosmological fact. In that sense, life on Earth is able to exist because of the cosmological features of our universe 14 billion years ago. Thank you.
I guess I'm not exactly sure why, in a colloquium among philosophers and physicists, some subjects should be ruled out because they weren't labeled in the title that brought us here. I was invited here to offer my perspective on an issue of importance between science and theism, and I've done so. I hope it was of interest, and I hope perhaps it was edifying, and I'm not going to be too worried about whether it was not exactly on the topic that Bill was prepared to argue here. I want to make only two relatively brief points. Of course, Darwin used the word random, and by that he meant, of course, blind. That is to say that variations are random in the sense that they are not correlated with, they are not brought about or caused by the needs that they meet, the benefits they may confer, or the advantages that they may provide the organisms that they find themselves in. And that's a reason why it's far better to substitute the word blind variation for random variation in understanding the process that Darwin identified. Similarly, Darwin used the word natural selection, and that's an unfortunate term too because it keeps us thinking about an intentional process, an active process that nature uses in order to cull among variants those which are worse and dispose of them, allowing the better ones to proceed. Far better to think about that part of the process as environmental filtration, a passive process, a process that acts like a sieve, preventing some things from passing through, allowing everything that is below a minimum size, to pursue this metaphor a little further, to pass through. And the essence of Darwin's discovery is that adaptations, things that look like they are the result of design, in fact are the result of a purely causal process that involves no design at all, no selection at all, no foresight at all, but is merely the result of blind variations and passive environmental filtration. If you're going to demand of yourself that you give a causal account of the nature of adaptations that honors the principles that I've identified in physics, you have no alternative but to give Darwin's account. And of course, it's only been 100 years since, 150 years now, since Darwin's account began to have wide circulation. And as I said, biology is much harder than quantum mechanics. Okay? Why is it harder than quantum mechanics? Because for one thing, it involves the operation of quantum principles, the operation of classical physical principles, the operation of chemical thermodynamic laws on a congeries of initial conditions so complicated, so fine, so different across various environments that we now know relatively less about life on our planet than we know about the cosmology of the universe. The standard model enables us to make predictions to 12 decimal places. Richard Feynman once said it's like predicting the distance from Los Angeles to New York to one's hair's breadth. We're not in that position in biology, okay? We're lucky that we have that wonderful graph that Bill showed us of the threefold phylogenetic kingdom of the archaea, the eukaryotes, and the prokaryotes. But if we're going to be serious about applying what we know from physics and chemistry to explain the nature of living processes, we're not going to have any alternative but to seek instances of this mechanism of blind variation and natural selection. Now, let me get on to one other point. Bill began by saying that the one obvious piece of the story of how adaptations emerged that I neglected was the fine-tuning of this universe. I'm in agreement with Sean and with other physicists that fine-tuning is a it's hard to actually put it in the right way without being impolite. Suffice it to say that Bill introduced the concept of red herring, and I'll use it here too. But even if the universe was fine-tuned for us, think about the additional interventions that God would have had to have introduced in order to get from the fine-tuning to us. The fine-tuning of the universe, the particular combination of the constants that are so identified, is compatible with, and indeed, according to the best of our science, need not have led to us. It most probably wouldn't have led to us. Thank you.
All right, well, we have a 5-minute break, so take it.